Hello, everyone. Really warm welcome to this inaugural lecture with our amazing Professor Lindsey Macmillan. Really glad to see you all here. I'm Mette Berg. I am the head of the Social Research Institute, and we have the privilege of having Lindsey among our staff. I'm going to introduce Lindsey briefly, and we'll then hear her inaugural lecture. We're then going to have a response from Professor Alissa Goodman, who has recently stepped down as the director of the Center for Longitudinal Studies. And we're then going to hopefully have a little bit of time for some questions from the floor. And around 7 o'clock, we're going to finish and move out to a drinks reception outside. So, okay. It's a really very special pleasure to introduce Lindsey Macmillan, who is Professor of Economics in our department, as well as being the founding director of the Center for Education Policy and Equalizing Opportunities within the Department of Learning and Leadership. Lindsey is also head of research in the Social Research Institute and was previously head of quantitative social science, which is one of the research centers within the department. And she has held numerous research grants from a range of funders and is the author of a string of academic publications as well as policy reports, all centered on the questions that she's going to be addressing in her lecture today, namely young people, social mobility, and barriers to opportunity. Lindsey has also held a string of roles in the policy world. So she is the Opportunity Mission Expert Reference Group. She's on the Opportunity Mission Expert Reference Group for the Department for Education. She is an expert advisor to the Labour Market Advisory Board for the Department for Work and Pensions. She's also expert advisor on the Independent Milburn Review into Young People and Work. She is a panel member for the Independent Inquiry into White Working Class Educational Disadvantage. She's on the Skills England Expert Advisory Group, and there's more. And she is currently on the Child Poverty Expert Advisory Group. Okay, and if that wasn't enough, she is also treasurer of the Scottish Economic Society and council member for the Royal Economic Society, as well as editor at Education Economics. So in short, very busy. Lindsey is a highly distinguished scholar, a sought-after expert advisor, and an all-round wonderful colleague who you would always want to have on your side. And I consider myself extremely privileged to be working with Lindsey, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk today. So let me finish here. Hand over to Lindsey, and really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mette. Thanks very much. Okay. Right. Okay, let's do this. So thank you so much to everyone who's here this evening. It is slightly overwhelming, but I'm really grateful to you all for coming to listen to my inaugural lecture on improving the life chances of disadvantaged young people. These inaugural lectures are really special occasions where you get to bring together people from like a range of different parts of your life and your career who've played a really important role in shaping that career and life, and it's really fantastic to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So let's start with defining the concept that's framed my entire research agenda for the past 21 years, intergenerational mobility. Everything I talk about tonight will be trying to better understand the link between parents' income in childhood and that child's income as a grown-up. So I've put in some little pictures here to help people understand. No offense. So think about the little boy in the picture on the left in the blue t-shirt with his lovely smiley family in his lovely nice kitchen. And then thinking about that little boy as a grown-up working in his nice job, counting his money. So the key question I'm trying to answer with all my work is why do children from rich families tend to end up rich as grown-ups, and why do children from poorer families tend to end up poorer as grown-ups? I will settle into this. I'm a little bit nervous, as you might be able to tell. So relative income mobility, or persistence, then, is measuring the relationship between childhood circumstances and adult incomes. So one way to think about this is if we lined up all the parents in the country from the poorest at one end to the richest at the other, and then we waited for their children to grow up, and we lined them up opposite them from the poorest at one end to the richest at the other. If the parents and children from the same families were all facing each other, we'd be in a world of perfect immobility. Where you came from fully determined where you ended up in the income distribution as an adult. An alternative scenario is you lined up the same parents from richest to poorest, but the children were randomly spread in the next generation. And that would be a world of perfect mobility. So where you end up in adulthood is not related at all to where you came from in childhood. Now, these are two extreme examples, and actually the reality is always that we're somewhere between those two cases. And what we do is we tend to look across countries or across time to try and understand where we are on that scale, relatively speaking. So mobility in this context is really about the extent to which where you come from is related to where you end up in terms of economic terms. So countries with higher mobility or lower persistence are said to have greater life chances for their disadvantaged young people. And this is a quote that I often start with, and I'm sorry to the CPO folk that have probably seen me do this like 100 times now. But I like this quote. It's from The Economist, and it says that most people are willing to accept wide inequalities within a generation, so those parents being really widely spread from the richest to the poorest, as long as it doesn't determine where those children end up as adults, so as long as it's coupled with equality of opportunity. But unfortunately, this is a false dichotomy. What tends to happen is that countries that have wider income inequality within a generation also tend to have less equal opportunities for the next generation, or worse social mobility. And the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the developed world in terms of income inequalities within a generation and in terms of opportunities across generations. Any questions so far? You all with me? Okay. Okay, so tonight, I'm settling now. We're going to be looking to answer the question, how do we equalize opportunities to improve the life chances of disadvantaged young people? And to answer that, and this one's for you, Dad, the purpose of my presentation is to do three things. Number one, take you through the three defining stages of my career to this point. Hopefully it's not over now. Two, summarize the main research contributions from each part. And then most importantly, to take away from this, don't worry about the research. I want you to think about what we can learn from that in terms of improving the life chances of disadvantaged young people. And why does it matter? Why are we sitting in this boiling hot room listening to me? Well, first and foremost, it matters because of fairness. No child's life chances should be determined by the family that they're born into. We want to improve the life chances, in particular of those that are born into disadvantaged families. But it also matters for representation. So a well-functioning society should see its population reflected in the people that run it. And it also matters for growth. So in our relentless search for growth, we're hampered, really hampered, by not making the best use of the available talent in the economy. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the lecture. So apparently, I really like doing things in blocks of 7. These circles are supposed to be the same size. Blame AI for that. But what's really pleasing to symmetry lovers like me is that these blocks all span 7 years. So it's almost like I delayed my inaugural until 2026 just so that I could do this. But for for the first block from 2005 to 2012, that spans from my graduation from undergrad to my graduation from my PhD and everything that came in between, which I'll talk about in a minute. The second block spans from becoming a lecturer at SRI, what it was before that, through to becoming a professor in 2019. And then the third era is all about CPO, the research centre. So preparing for a talk like this is quite different from regular talks. Jenny said to me earlier it's one of the hardest talks she's ever given, and I'm feeling that right now, Jenny. We often talk at home when I'm giving a presentation about the type of talk it is in terms of music records. So if I'm feeling relatively chilled about it, we're rolling out an old classic, it's one I've done tons of times before, then everything's okay. If I'm slightly more nervous, if it's a new project or paper, then I'm going to be a bit more stressed and it's a new release. And then if I'm particularly stressed, if I'm giving a keynote, for example, then I might be doing the greatest hits, for example. Well, tonight, and especially for my Swifties in the audience, this is my Eras tour. Although I really promise not to keep you here for 3 hours, not to do loads of outfit changes, and definitely not to sing. So before I dig in, I briefly mentioned there's been a bit of a delay in getting to my inaugural lecture. I was actually made a professor 7 years ago. There was a little thing called a pandemic that happened at that time, and there was also a little boy who came along during that time. But it's a huge bonus because instead of having a crazy 2-year-old Isla and a crazy 4-year-old Callum, sorry Callum, I've now got an 11-year-old, a nearly 9-year-old, and a 4-year-old, Callum, Isla, and Lachlan. And I'm really privileged that Callum is old enough to want to be here this evening to listen with his cousin Zach, who's kind of listening, and their big cousin Lucas as well. Thank you guys for being here. It means a lot to me. Lachlan is not here this evening because I would not be allowed to stand on this stage talking because Mummy is not allowed to go anywhere without him, so he's at home. So this era, okay, so first era, let's take it in chunks of 3. So this era spans from my undergraduate graduation and covers my time as a research assistant at CMPO in Bristol, doing my master's and my PhD at Bristol, and spending a year at Harvard doing a postdoc in the middle of my PhD. So throughout this period, my main focus was really on trying to better understand trends in how incomes and work are passed across generations. Let's see if I can get through this bit without crying. Okay, so I was really fortunate enough on graduation from university. Come on in. It's a good moment to break. So I was fortunate enough on graduation from university to get a job as a research assistant at CMPO in Bristol. My main plan at that point had been to become a waitress in a restaurant. It was a job that I'd been doing since school. It was a job that I did all the way through university, and a job that I really loved. But my big sister said, no, come on, what are you going to do? And my lecturer, Jervis Huxley, badgered me continuously into applying for a job at this research centre. I've got to be honest, I had absolutely no idea what academia was at that point. I had no idea really what research was. But I took a look at their website and I saw that they worked on issues that really mattered to me. And so I'll always remember walking into that interview. Simon Burgess and Paul Gregg were sat behind a table. They asked me tons of questions about logit models that I definitely couldn't answer. But somehow I managed to get that job. Simon and Paul have continued to be really important people in my life ever since. Unfortunately, Paul can't be here this evening because he's sunning himself in Portugal. But I'm so grateful. That's what retirement looks like, guys. But I'm so grateful that Simon Burgess is here in the room this evening. And I really want to thank everyone at CMPO and Bristol, and particularly Simon, Paul, and Carol Proper for changing the trajectory of my life with giving me that first job. The legacy, actually, that research centre has created in terms of the early career researchers that they've brought on is fully down to the people that ran that research centre. And it was a really special time and place. Don't cry, Simon, I'm going to cry. Okay. Let's talk about research. That's not emotional. So we knew from the work that Paul had done previously with Joe Blandon, with Alissa Goodman, and with Steve Machin, that intergenerational income mobility in the UK was a problem. They just put out a hugely influential Sutton Trust report and written a book chapter in this book, which I still have, which showed that mobility had got worse over time, or persistence had increased from a cohort born in 1958 to a cohort born in 1970. using our birth cohort studies. There had also been theoretical advancements in our understanding of the role of education in the transmission of incomes across generations by work from Solon in this same book, building on models of Becker and Tomes. We're back to the pictures, everyone, because we're talking about theory now. So this really works through two channels. We're back with our little smiley boy in the blue T-shirt in his nice kitchen. So the first channel that this works through is that there's educational inequalities. So young people from richer families have more investments made into them by their parents, which enable them to attend an elite university. That's what this guy is doing, studying really hard at his fancy university. And these educational inequalities differ by the circumstances of your family. The second channel is that education that you get through the schooling system and at university has different payoffs in the labour market. So the same child is there sitting counting his money because he went to a nice university, which meant that he got a nice job at the end of it. And these are the channels to think of when we're thinking about the way that income is transmitted across generations. Good timing, Joe. So, in my first paper, there she is. So in my first paper, together with Joe and Paul, we applied this theoretical model to the birth cohort studies to look at the role of education in the transmission of incomes across generations and to see how much it could help us understand the decline in mobility that Joe and Paul and Alissa and Steve had found previously. And what we found really confirmed the theoretical models. So education and skills could account for over half of the income transmission across generations. And interestingly, we also found that educational inequalities could account for 85% of the decline in mobility over time. So it was the widening of the gap between the educational attainment that young people from different backgrounds, from richer and poorer backgrounds, got in the 1970 cohort relative to the 1958 cohort that was really driving that increase in persistence across generations or the decline in mobility. You got a photo? Can I move on? And I've carried on this work since. It's good that some of you got that. Trying to understand broad trends in mobility throughout my career. So in joint work with John Jerram, using international PIAC data, we looked at the relationship between social mobility and inequality using a harmonized data set for the first time. This is Kevin De Bruyne, for those of you who are not understanding. He looks exactly like John Jerram, so I will show a picture of John later just to confirm this. Sorry, Nikki. Should have explained. So in this work, using harmonized data, we confirmed that there was a relationship between, so countries with greater inequality tended to have less equal opportunities for young people. But we also found that countries that have more inequality within a generation also have greater educational inequalities. So bigger gaps in attainment between children from richer and poorer families. So our original findings from the work with Joe and Paul weren't just a UK phenomenon. These educational inequalities were actually central to explaining patterns both across time and across countries. Here we go, Sonia. And as administrative data linkages have improved over time, more recently we've been able to make use of the wealth of data about the population of state-educated young people to understand better how social mobility varies across places within a country, so within England in this context. So in a report for the Social Mobility Commission, which came out during the pandemic, we were able to show that where you grow up matters. So some areas, the light areas on this map, the adult earnings of children from poorer and richer backgrounds were actually not very far apart. So there were small gaps in the earnings between the adult earnings for children from more and less disadvantaged backgrounds. Whereas in the darker regions, there were much bigger earnings gaps between children from more and less disadvantaged backgrounds. And the differences across place here were really substantial. So the difference in pay gaps between the darker regions and the lighter regions were about 2.5 times bigger. So even within countries, you're getting a lot of variation in the social mobility that young people experience depending on where they grow up. And we followed up on this work since in a recent paper which came out in Fiscal Studies, but Sonia and I are now working on a project which Luke Sibieta is leading with Darcy Snape from IFS, trying to unpick the role of local area and family level characteristics in understanding what's driving these differences. I feel like we'll be working on these questions for a while to come yet. Okay, so much like many people who work on social mobility, we as a family experience social mobility of our own. So despite my southern accent, my plummy southern accent, I was actually born and spent the first few years of my life just outside of Glasgow in a new town called East Kilbride. We lived initially on the top floor of a block of council flats, and then we moved to this beautiful council house when I was just before I was 1. And that council house, my parents were actually given the chance to buy. And that meant that they were actually able to become geographically mobile. So when work opportunities disappeared in Glasgow in the mid-80s, we were able to move down to the southeast of England and take advantage of the opportunities that existed down there. But this did also come at a cost. Yeah, I know, nice fringe, eh? This is a common occurrence throughout these photos. Thanks, Mum. But this did come at a cost. I think we felt it as kids. I remember being mocked for my Scottish accent, which I quickly hid. And my little sister, who was born in England, was always reminded, "You're English," whenever we went back home. So we really didn't fit very well in either place, I don't think. But it also had a cost for my parents. My dad is one of 8 siblings, and my mum is one of 7. So we have a big extended family back up the road. And they were the first in our family and one of the very few who ever left that small area that we're from. Since becoming a parent myself, with my parents living just up the road, I fully understand now how much it must have taken to move away with 2 wee girls, so far away from that support network, to an entirely different place. Me and my sisters are very grateful for the opportunities they gave us. And we weren't the only ones who moved from Scotland to England in 1986. The man, the legend, the reason that Callum is called Callum Alexander. Yeah, I'm a massive United fan, and I really couldn't get through this inaugural lecture without including Sir Alex in some way. So there he is. That's it. That's all I have to say about that. Tenuous. So throughout my time at CMPO, I learned of ESRC-funded studentships that would pay for me to study for a master's and a PhD. Again, I had absolutely no desire to become an academic when I was at school. Maybe still don't. Joking. But with these opportunities, Paul kind of convinced me that I should try, that it was something I could do. And so I applied for this studentship, and I was eventually awarded one to study an economics and public policy master's at Bristol and then do a PhD with Paul. So me and my sisters were the first in our family to go to university. So this was quite a big step to take, continuing on to a master's and a PhD. This part of my academic career is where my interest in labour market participation began, particularly for young people from deprived backgrounds. We had a youth unemployment crisis at the time, in the wake of a Great Recession. And in work with Paul, Greg, and Jack Britton, we were able to show that there are a lot of early indicators of which young people are going to end up not in education, employment, or training that occur earlier in their life when they're in the education system, including low qualifications, coming from a disadvantaged background, and school attendance. This is something I'm going to come back to later as it's come back round again. My master's dissertation and my PhD were focused on intergenerational joblessness. So were young people from jobless families more likely to be jobless themselves? This was another trend that had worsened over time for those born in 1970 compared to those born in 1958. And it was at a time when Ian Duncan Smith was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and was talking a lot about never working families to try and justify widespread welfare reform. We managed, as part of my PhD, to use data to show that never working families was in fact a myth. There are almost no families in the UK where 2 generations have never worked, despite what you read in the papers at the time. During my PhD, I experienced some geographical mobility of my own, spending a year in the US to work at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I was lucky enough during my time there at Harvard to meet with Bill Wilson on a number of occasions to talk to him about my research. Those discussions inspired my analysis into how intergenerational joblessness varies by local labour markets. And the findings here are really striking, I think, and important for thinking about the role of place in driving inequalities. I found that in areas with low unemployment, there's essentially no relationship between growing up in a jobless household and becoming jobless yourself as an adult. Whereas in areas with high unemployment, there's a really strong intergenerational persistence between growing up in a jobless household and ending up jobless yourself. Importantly, I found that this pattern was essentially identical across the US, with no welfare for anyone who's never worked, and the UK with a more generous welfare system. And this is suggestive that intergenerational joblessness is much more related to labour market conditions than it is related to cultures of welfare dependency. On my return to the UK, I finished off my PhD. I moved to London and was generously hosted at Case by John Hills and Ruth Lupton. The kindness and support of that group of people was really important. John would always stop and take time to talk to me about my research, despite being super busy himself. And the guy was a true legend, and I, along with many others, miss him very much. At the end of this era, I graduated from my PhD. There's me and Paul outside the Bristol Institute, looking very happy. And we moved on to era 2. So towards the end of my PhD, I learned of some jobs opening up in the department that housed the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. I'd worked with the cohort studies through my PhD, through my master's, through my time as a research assistant. And so I knew of Jane Elliott, I knew of Lucinda Platt, and of Alice Sullivan, who were all leading the studies at the time. Of course, the department was also the home of the legends that were Lorraine Dearden and Anna Vinyals. And I'd learned a lot from them through reading their work. So the department felt like a natural fit for me. So the second era began when I was offered a lectureship in that department after finishing my PhD in the summer of 2012, at the same time as John Jerram. And this is what John Jerram actually looks like. And now you can see that he is indeed Kevin De Bruyne in disguise. Again, this is another part of my career development that's full of supportive people and lasting friendships. I was allocated an office during that time with Jill Wyness, Morag Henderson, and initially Maria Cerrone and then Nikki Shaw. These women have been a constant source of support when things get hard and make me laugh like very few others. The department is also during that time hired Alissa Goodman and Emla Fitzsimons, 2 other really important people. And Emla and I had the pleasure of supervising Nancy together, and Alissa and I had the pleasure of supervising Claire Tyler and Catherine Dilnott during that time, 2 people that I'll come back to towards the end. I also had the support of some great heads of department during this period, including John Micklewright, David Voas, when I moved to DLL, Susie O'Neill, and then coming back to SRI, Toby Seddon, and now Mette. And I'd like to thank all of the head of departments for the support they've given me. Over and above anything else, the defining thing about this era was that I became a mum. No. I thought I'd get a handle on this by now. First to Callum in 2015, and then to Isla in 2017. Not quite finished. Being a mum has changed absolutely the way I think about absolutely everything, and I'm grateful to those guys for everything they've taught me over the past 11 years. Okay. Nice words finished. So in this era, with the move to the Institute of Education, I became more focused on the role of education in driving inequalities across generation. So that first part of the puzzle, understanding why there were inequalities in the education that young people received. This is where I started to think about the life course perspective. So thinking about how inequalities evolve throughout childhood and at various parts of the system, including in schools, in higher education, and then intergenerational effects. In a key piece of work with Anna Vinyals, there's a little in-house joke going on here, in that Claire is apparently the IOE building on our website, and so I had to sneak that in. The work's actually really important though, so let's get back to that. Sorry, Claire. I did ask. I think you thought I was joking. So in this work, we used linked administrative data to show how differences in attainment from children from different backgrounds evolve throughout childhood. So following the same children through school, we can see that if you look at the bar right on the left-hand side, by age 7, I don't know my left and right, so I hope I got that right. Yeah, the one over there. So at key stage 1, by key stage 1 at age 7, a child from the most disadvantaged families is on average 17 percentiles behind a child from the least disadvantaged families. And despite the education system attempting to help in minimize these educational inequalities, we can see that gap widens throughout the education system, so that by age 16, by the 4th bar along, at key stage 4, when they take their GCSEs, the same children from the most deprived backgrounds are now 29 percentiles behind children from the least deprived backgrounds. And this has lasting consequences, both in terms of future employability and earnings. I think perhaps even more concerningly in this paper, we showed that high-achieving young people from the most disadvantaged families, that's the dashed blue line which is kind of going down, fall behind their lower attaining, more affluent peers throughout the schooling system, and in particular at key stage 3. The renewed focus on the New Schools White Paper on key stage 3 is really welcome based on this. But we were able to show also that sorting into schools was driving some of this effect. So when you compare young people that went to the same school, these trends are far less pronounced. So the way that we allocate pupils into schools is a really important part of these educational inequalities that we can see. Looking cool there, Matt. So in work with Simon Burgess, Claire Crawford, actual photo now, and Matt Dixon, we looked into this issue of how pupils get allocated to schools, and in particular at the role of grammar schools, schools that select by ability in driving intergenerational inequalities. Here we were looking at both the impact of selective school structures on later inequality and also inequalities in who's getting into those grammar schools in the first place. Full disclosure here, me and my sisters did go to a grammar school. There we are in our Tunbridge Wells Girls Grammar School uniforms. And that's me at the back of the Year 7 photo with the lovely fringe. This is my friend Alex, and this is my friend Emily, who's sitting right there. They've been stuck with me ever since, and I'm really grateful that they're still here. Thank you. So Dad and I have had many debates, is that fair to say, Dad? About the contribution of these schools to our own social mobility stories. And I think this is really typical of why we still hear so many people saying that they're key to bringing them back to drive more social mobility. It's often coming from the small proportion of people who attended those schools themselves. And it's easy to take the view that these schools were a key feature in how we got to where we got to today, but we don't know the counterfactual. Chances are that the vast majority of us would have been just fine in a comprehensive system. But what we see when we grow up in a grammar school area are the non-grammar schools in that area have had the top 20, 25% most affluent, in some cases most able children cream skimmed off them. So we don't actually see a comprehensive system. What we see is an unequal system. And it's only through looking at the system as a whole and how it works for all young people that we can make a judgment about how a system is doing in terms of whether it drives inequalities or not. Have I convinced you, Dad? I hope so. So in a paper with Simon Burgess and Matt Dixon, both from my CMPO days, we took this system-wide approach to try and understand whether grammar school areas drove inequality. What we did was we compared people that grew up in selective school areas to people who grew up in really similar comprehensive schooling areas. And we looked at what earnings people from those two different areas ended up to go on and achieve. And here we were particularly interested in the inequality, the distributions of those earnings. And what we found was that people that grew up in selective schooling areas experienced far more income inequality in adulthood than children that grew up in comprehensive areas. And where this matters is that at the top of the distribution, people from selective school areas earn more than people from the comprehensive school areas, but at the bottom of the distribution, that's where the costs come in. People from selective school areas earn significantly less than people from comprehensive schooling areas. And this was a sizable effect. It could explain about a quarter of the overall wage inequality that we found. Given these large inequalities driven by those types of systems, it's important then to understand who's getting into the grammar schools in the selective systems. This is like the Economist quote that I started with. People might say, well, that's okay. It's okay to have systems that create wide inequalities as long as everyone has a chance of making it. So in this paper with Simon, again, and with Claire Crawford, we wanted to look at who got into grammar schools. As I've shown you, there are wide inequalities that evolve through childhood. So already by age 11, disadvantaged young people are behind their more affluent peers in terms of their performance at school. What we wanted to do in this paper is understand whether there were differences in the chances of getting into a grammar school. He's told me he's leaving. It's not because it's boring. Sorry to embarrass you. So what we wanted to do in this paper was we wanted to try and compare the chances of getting into grammar school for children from different backgrounds that were performing the same at primary school. So take two children who were in the top 20th percentile of performance at the end of primary school in the Key Stage 2 test that everyone takes. A child from a more affluent background has a 40 percentage point higher chance of getting into a grammar school in a selective school area than a child from a more deprived background, even though they're both in the top 20% of performance in Key Stage 2. And work by Sam Sims and John Jerram has pointed to the really important role of private tutoring in this story. Another example of how affluent families can invest resources into their children to get them into the schools that they want to get them into, that disadvantaged families cannot afford. And these inequalities persist beyond the schooling system. So we know that access to university in this country is unequal, largely driven by differences in the qualifications that children have obtained in school. But we also know that what you study at university matters in the labour market. So work by Jack and Matt and other colleagues at IFS has shown is that on average you get paid more if you studied an economics degree at LSE, for example, compared to a humanities degree at insert some lower ranked institution that I'm not going to get myself into trouble for saying. So with the Mismatch crew, Stuart Campbell, Rich Murphy, Jill Wyness and myself, We wanted to look beyond broad participation gaps in attending university to understand if there were inequalities in the types of courses that young people study at university. So do equally qualified young people from different backgrounds match to a course that gives them an equal chance of success in the labour market? And the answer, again, we found to that, it won't surprise you by this point, I'm sure, is no, they don't. Across all young people, from the lowest attainers to the highest attainers, young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds attend lower ranked university courses than their similarly attaining, more affluent peers. And this is predominantly driven by the school they attend, which suggests that there's an important role for what's happening within school in terms of the information, the advice, and the guidance that young people are getting about the choices that they're making. And here we are with the big green dinosaur at a crazy golf place in Austin, Texas, where Rich lives. So in more recent work with Joe Blandon, Oliver Cassanew-Francis, and Jill, we look at where young people from different backgrounds, from different schools, apply to in their university applications to see if their application profiles look different. Is it the choices that they're making that are driving these inequalities in enrollment that we end up seeing in the mismatch paper? And we do find really big differences, I think, in terms of the application profiles. So the black line is students from, that attend private schools, typically more affluent students. And also, to a lesser extent, grammar school pupils, which is the yellow line. They both make more ambitious choices across their 5 applications to university than children who attend comprehensive state schools. So this is suggesting there is some potential, perhaps, in the state sector to think about the ambition of the applications that young people are making. And we also know that inequalities in education can have intergenerational effects. So from work that Matt did with Paul and Harriet Robinson previously, we know that children of mothers who experienced an extra year of schooling by being affected by the raising of the school leaving age from 15 to 16 in 1972, the children also went on to have higher test scores and get higher educational qualifications. So in a paper with Emma Tominey, also from CMPO, we were interested to look into why this was happening. What was it that changed for these mothers? And what we found was that that increase in maternal education led not only to better family resources, so more money, then partnering with higher educated partners, and also more pre-birth employment for those mothers, but it also led to greater parental investment. So it led to an improved home learning environment, and it led to better prenatal behaviors for the mother. So what's really important here is that more education can lead to more money to invest in children, but can also improve the choices that parents are making. How are we doing? Anyone need a drink yet? Whew. We're on era 3, so we're okay. We're nearly there. Hello? Can I open the door? Can someone open the door? Thank you. I am really hot up here, so yeah, it's unpleasant. All right, Dan? Sneaking in? Have you just arrived? Okay. It's 10 minutes left. Okay. I hope that gets a bit better. Sorry. Should have brought some fans from the CPO office.
I'm going to take
Boom,
the
boom.
chair as well. Sorry,
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to carry on, otherwise I run a risk of overrunning. So we're on the final era, era 3. Era 3 is the era where I became mum to Lachlan, who's now 4.5. The half year is super important when you're 4. And it's also the era of CPO, the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, that we started back in 2019. And here's a collection of photos of the CPO team that we've built over the past 7 years. I'm going to just show you a video to show what we're about as CPO. And this is from something we had made for our launch back in 2020. Let's hope it works.
When we're born, we should have the same chances in life. But some are born into more fortunate circumstances, while others are less lucky. Even before we start school, our lives are already on different tracks. This means that we get different opportunities. And destinations can end up being determined by where we come from, not talent or hard work. Education policy is an important part of how society lays those tracks. Our mission is to inform policy and wider practice to help us lay new tracks, so our destinations are less set from birth, meaning your success is more about your talent and effort, and less about how lucky you were when you were born. The UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, CPO, is the only research centre dedicated to improving life chances across the entire life course. We research what works to make opportunities more equal, helping us all reach destinations we want in life. Follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our newsletter to discover our latest findings.
It hasn't aged well, has it? We did not foresee Elon Musk when we got that made. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the centre. But I think, one of the most important things about the centre is that the team that we've created there and the kind of joy that we have on a daily basis. This, for example, is our famous magnet fridges. If you've ever visited us, you'll know that instead of a warm greeting or welcome, you're instantly dragged to the magnet fridges to tell us your favourite magnet immediately from our extensive collection. No, it's not for you to keep. It's to fuel our competitive spirit, pushing one of the team members further up the leaderboard. I think at the moment it's Claire with no eyes, am I right?
There's been a change.
Oh, what? There's a change today?
Fabian overtook me today.
Ah, Fabian. See, there's plenty of time left this year for anyone to take the win. But it's this team spirit that we have that really makes it joyful to come to work every day. And I'm so grateful to the team that we've built for all the experiences that they bring and everything that they do. Back to me. In terms of my own research, this era has been more about extending our understanding of what happens beyond the education system and into the labour market. So if we go back to the framework, Smiley Little Boy's Back, going to university and then counting his money, this part is about the labour market experiences for young people from different backgrounds that happen when we compare young people that have the same education and skills. So why does income persist? Why does your family income in childhood persist in terms of your adult outcomes, even if you've gone on to achieve everything that you possibly could in the education system? And we see this play out in the data. If we compare young people of the same education and skills, particularly among high earners and low earners, we see that there's still a really strong association between childhood family income and adult earnings. Now, this is also the killer chart that really shifted my focus beyond education. I remember very clearly making this chart. I was sat under my stairs like Harry Potter during the pandemic. And I made this graph when we were working on the Social Mobility Commission report. And a light bulb came on in my head. What we were trying to understand was how much education could account for the pay gaps that we saw on that map at the beginning across places. So we lined up all the places on a graph from the most mobile on the left to the least mobile on the right. And we plotted how much education could explain of the pay gaps and how much education could not explain of the pay gaps. And what we saw is that, as I've hopefully drilled into you by now, educational inequalities accounts for a large part of the pay gaps everywhere. That's the kind of light orange part of this graph. But it accounts for a pretty stable part of the pay gaps everywhere. What it couldn't do is really explain to us what was driving differences in the pay gaps across places. That's the darker orange part of this graph. This is telling us that we really do need to look beyond the education system to understand why some places are more equal than others. So into the labour market we go. In some work with Jill and Rich Murphy, which we're currently extending with Oliver Cassigny-Francis and with Fabien Petit, the leaderboard winner of the Magnets at the moment. Damn him. We can look at entry-level careers, and what we see, in a really similar manner to what we see in the higher education space, is that across the distribution of attainment of young people, from the lowest attaining to the highest attaining, young people from disadvantaged backgrounds also work in lower pay or lower ranked occupations than their similarly attaining, more affluent peers. And this led us to ask why this is happening. Do people from poorer backgrounds just prefer different types of jobs? Do they just want to work in different types of jobs? Or are they applying to the same types of jobs as their advantaged peers but not getting hired? And this is the basis for our Nuffield-funded work on inequalities in access to professional careers with Claire Tyler, she's here, I can see her, and with Catherine Dilnott, both who have started as my PhD students back in 2015 and have gone on to have really successful careers themselves, so much so that Catherine has already retired. So over that time, since they started as PhD students back in 2015, and really predominantly since Nuffield started funding us in 2022, which allowed us to build this incredible project, we've built essentially an early careers data hub, working with now more than 21 large employers. And we have over 2.5 million applicants to graduate level jobs, to all entry level roles, to try and understand what's driving inequalities and what we see in the labour market. So this data is very cool. It covers the whole recruitment process from application all the way through to whether young people are made an offer or not. And crucially, we can observe a range of information about the applicant, including the university they attended, the subject they studied, and crucially, their socioeconomic background, their gender, and their ethnicity. And a few main findings emerge from this work, too many for me to cover tonight. But the two that I want to focus on is, first of all, working class young people are well represented in the applicant pools for these graduate training programs. So if we compare the proportion of working class applicants in the applicant pools that we have to the proportion of working class people in the national pool of graduates, there's about a quarter in each. So working class people are well represented in the applicant pools for these jobs. They're not applying. This isn't an outreach problem. But the working class is the green part of this bar. What you can see is that that green part of the bar gets smaller as you work your way through the recruitment processes for these programs. And what we find is that working class applicants are 32% less likely to achieve a job offer to these graduate training programs. And even when we compare applicants who look the same on paper, who are studying at the same university, that working class applicant has overcome many barriers to get to the point where they can be at the same university, studying the same subject. They are still 18% less likely to get a job offer to these graduate training programs than a professional background applicant who looks the same on paper. Interestingly, we're also finding that online testing is creating around half of these inequalities. And in a new project that's been funded by Nuffield, we're diving deeper, which Claire is leading. We're diving deeper into these questions to try and understand what it is about online testing which is driving these disparities, not just for working class applicants actually, but also for ethnic minority applicants. The gaps for black applicants are entirely driven by online testing, which is a really stark finding. Okay, let me try and pull this all together. So the centrality of education and skills development in the transmissions of income across generations, but also the need to look beyond education, motivates the structure of the CPO research that we do, from early years all the way through to adulthood. So the work of Heckman and colleagues really emphasizes the importance here of early years and the formation of skills. So having a strong base to build on is super important in the early years. It means that the building blocks are in place for everything that comes next. Skills beget skills. The fact that SES gaps open so early means that children from disadvantaged backgrounds already have fewer building blocks to build on. As they enter the school system, on average, they tend to have less vocabulary that they can access, and then fewer tools or building blocks to consolidate that next stage of their learning. Throughout school, as I've shown you, we see SES gaps widening, in part due to differential investments that are occurring at home, but also due to differential access to schooling. There are differences, as we know, between state and private schools. There's also differences within the school system in the schools that young people can access. As we move into tertiary education, over half the population do not go to university. They don't continue past 18. And even among those that do go to university, as we've showed you, you can see that individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, from more disadvantaged backgrounds, are attending courses that are going to lead to lower payoffs in the labour market. And finally, even if they've overcome all of those barriers and done all of the right things, we see that when children enter into the labour market, they're also less likely to get jobs than their similarly attaining more affluent peers. Bleak, huh? But it does also mean that there are multiple points that we can intervene. So let me try and kind of think a little bit about what's coming down the tracks and why there might be some reason for hope. A major focus of my time currently is trying to help think about issues for young people not in education, employment and training through work that I'm doing on the Labour Market Advisory Board, but also through work that I'm supporting with in the Milburn Review of Young People and Work. I've just come from there today, actually, and we've had quite an intense session. So it's I'm actually feeling a little bit inspired by it. I think there's hope. There's not hope in this data. NEET rates are as high now as they were back when we were working on them back at the time of the Great Recession, with almost 1 million young people not in education, employment or training. The worrying thing is the composition of NEETs now looks quite different to what it looked like back then. So we have more inactivity now and fewer young people actually actively seeking work than we did back in 2010. And we know that there's lots of challenges, not just in terms of current NEETs, but also in terms of what's coming through the education system. From our very own Cosmos study, led by Jake Anders, joint with CLS and the Sutton Trust, we found that 44% of young people report experiencing levels of high psychological distress in that Cosmos study, compared to 23% 20 years ago. There's huge spikes in mental health issues now. And from this excellent report from the IFS, we see soaring rates of education and healthcare plans, primarily driven by increasing ASD diagnosis, but also speech and language needs and social, emotional, and mental health needs. There's also really big challenges around school attendance and disengagement in the schooling system that I haven't put on here because I thought so many graphs would depress you. But these are all really important predictors of future NEET rates. And so the challenge here for us all is enormous. The good news, I had to try and find some, and I think this is about as good as I can do, is that I think policymakers are listening and thinking hard about how we can create better systems in this space at the moment, joined up systems to deal with these issues. So DFE and DWP are working together much more closely through the Opportunities Mission. And as I said, Alan Milburn's been tasked with leading an inquiry into young people and work. And from the session I attended this afternoon, this is exactly the space that report is in. Like, thinking system-wide is the key to this. We've reached the end, people. So what should you take away from all of this in improving the life chances of disadvantaged young people? First of all, education policy can make a difference. Reducing inequalities in education can reduce inequalities in earnings. We know that disadvantaged high achievers fall behind in Key Stage 3 in particular, and I think that's a really good signal that the school's white paper is thinking in this space. There's very little talk going on about systems design and admissions policies in schools. It seems something that people don't want to go near, but they matter, and they can drive inequalities. There's also information constraints which hinder disadvantaged young people, and the education system as a whole has a job of stepping in when young people might not have access to that information and guidance in their home lives. And we know also that improving education can have intergenerational effects. It can affect the next generation that we're bringing up, not just in terms of the money that the parents have, but also in terms of the actions and behaviours. Other things that I haven't talked about, because you'd be here all night, but also lots of other people are doing really important work in this space. Early years investment is vital here. Brilliant work by colleagues on the Sure Start schemes from the previous New Labour government have shown that that policy was effective in improving the GCSE results, particularly of disadvantaged young people. So expanding family hubs is a key policy and giving access to disadvantaged young people to that. The childcare offer that we have for 9-month-olds is currently skewed towards more advantaged families. If we're really serious about equalising opportunities, we need to offer that childcare to people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. This is something Becky talks about a lot, and it's absolutely vital. Teachers are also really vital. Simon talks about this a lot. Sam talks about this a lot. The incentive structures we have in place across schools and within schools means that often the best quality teaching occurs for the children that don't actually need it the most. We skew good quality teachers towards exam years, Key Stage 4, at the expense of Key Stage 3. We skew it to top sets at the expense of lower sets. We skew it towards better schools at the expense of the schools that really could do with those teachers the most. Transitions really matter. Primary to secondary, we see a lot of evidence around disengagement occurring for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds when they move from a school with one teacher to a school with lots of teachers. They don't have necessarily the support to help them with that at home. We need to really get in there and support these children when they move across these systems. But also post-16 and post-18 is, quite frankly, a mess if you're not on an academic pathway. And we really need to think hard about what those transitions look like, especially for the most disadvantaged young people who really need those systems to work for them. This relates to having valued and valuable non-academic pathways in that space, and lots of work by SEVA that Sandra led has spoken to this need for creating these really robust and valued non-academic pathways. And finally, recovery. We have such a linear system. If you do not hit all the marks you have to hit at 16, at 18, you drop out, it's very hard to get back onto the education track in our system. Finding ways to recover education for people that don't do things in a perfect order is becoming increasingly important when we think about the challenges that young people are facing with regards to SEND need, with regards to mental health. Finally, education policy isn't everything, despite what our centre's called. The labour market really matters, and employers play a really important role in improving life chances, as we've seen through our work on recruitment, for example. Crucially, we need a joined-up approach between education policymakers, employers, and the voluntary and community sector here to catch these people, to take them through the journey into adulthood. And as I've pointed to, there's challenges facing this generation unlike any we've seen before. So we have a lot to do. Done.
So good evening, everyone. And Lindsey, thank you so much for your incredibly inspiring and amazing talk. So besides the notes that I've prepared, I think one thing that I was thinking as I was listening to you, and the way that you've modestly sort of described each of those papers, each and every one of them have been like major sort of paradigm shifting work that provides evidence about the world that we did not know and that makes a difference for policy and that matters. And that sort of depth and breadth of your contribution is just immense. And it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to say that to you directly. And I know how much I've been looking forward to hearing what you have to say, because truly you are a giant in your field. And we're very fortunate to be your colleague and to benefit from everything that you've shown us and that you've learned. So, back onto the script. Well, I wanted to start by saying how much I'd personally been looking forward to hearing what you're going to say, and I know that everyone around the department and your colleagues have been. It's a huge honour also, of course, to be asked to respond to your inaugural lecture. And I'd say it's either returning the favour or perhaps what I might alternatively phrase as having the opportunity to get my own back, as you bravely did mine for me back in 2018. So I've personally had the privilege of knowing Lindsey and working with her in different ways at every stage of her career, as it turns out. Oh, thank you, Simon, for plundering the photo records from CMPO. So it's amazing to realise, it was amazing for me to realise that I've been sort of in some way connected and working with you, Lindsey, from the very start of your research career. Starting back at CMPO some 20 years ago, through to this commanding giant in the field of social mobility and academic leader that we've had a privilege of listening to today. So I wanted to start under the kind of gaze of the young, innocent Lindsey there. I wanted to start by saying a few words about my own first impressions before broadening it out to some of the sort of thoughts and contributions from others. So Lindsey and I first met, I think it was 2006, when I was an economist at IFS, and Lindsey was this brilliant brand new researcher at CMPO. And we worked together on a Joseph Rowntree Foundation project that Paul Gregg and I were collaborating on. It wasn't until around 2010, and that JRF project was rumbling on many years, that Lindsey and I got to know each other better, and that was around midway through your PhD. So we got to know each other more personally at a very prestigious Manchester University residential summer school that Lindsey had won a place on. And I was invited to be a discussant for her PhD paper on intergenerational worklessness. So my very first impressions of Lindsey then, which I think in some ways surprised me given her sort of presence and confidence nowadays, it was just you were actually quite shy and sort of quite very nervous, I would say, to have your PhD work discussed by me. But of course, the moment that we started discussing it, the sharpness of her mind, the quality of her work, and above all, her determination to make a difference through the power of her research really came through. So I wanted to spend more time talking about that Manchester summer school because of the Robert Putnam in a helicopter story, but I know that there's drinks. So anyway, I won't actually tell that one. But maybe I will if I have time.
You should tell them what the conference was about when he flew in his helicopter.
So basically, all right, I'm sorry, because Lindsey is now laughing, I will tell the story, which is that, so many of the greats of American quantitative sociology were at the Manchester Summer School. There'd been a sort of deal. And one of those was Robert Putnam. So Lindsey and I were both very startled when a helicopter arrived to take him on the helicopter pad of the mansion at which we were being housed. He was being taken to number 10 Downing Street to advise on how to improve the life chances of disadvantaged young people, which is an irony that was not lost on many of us at the summer school. Okay, so not long after that, Lindsey and I became colleagues at the IOE. Lindsey came straight after her PhD as a lecturer, as she's described, and I joined the department just a few months later. So besides the very intense excitement and occasional nerves of supervising our brilliant PhD students, Claire and Catherine, the thing I remember most about those years was the sheer number of times that I've literally had to throw myself at Lindsey to prevent her from taking up great job offers from rival institutions. It's a signal, of course, of her merit, what lengths so many have gone to try and hire Lindsey. And I did also want to say, Lindsey, I think it's a really good call that you stayed, looking at all that you've achieved. So I don't feel uncomfortable with having tried to persuade you. Right, so beyond those few experiences of my own that I wanted to share, I wanted to draw out 3 themes and some thoughts that others have shared with me in thinking about Lindsey's career and her approach. Right. So, first of all, as you heard in her talk, her laser-like focus on influencing policy in order to make a difference in people's lives. In preparing for this talk, you talked about your job interview with Simon and Paul. Simon and Paul actually both shared some reflections about that job interview too. Simon reminded me that he and Paul interviewed you over the phone, and even then it was clear that you had a deeply held and fully genuine passion for making a difference to the world, alongside your extraordinary determination and piercing intelligence. So Anna Vignoles, who you've mentioned, Anna, you are here. Hello, Anna. Has also reflected on the many heated debates that you two have had together about social mobility and how to narrow socioeconomic gaps in education outcomes. Those debates always characterised by passion as well as analytical rigour. So, and Jill Wyness, Lindsey's Deputy Director at CPO, has reminded me that as well as all the intensive input that you've had on Alan Milburn's task force, you've had recently not one but two recent handwritten thank you notes from the current Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. So all the modesty, Lindsey, but you're right in there at the centre of things in a really important way. Okay, so the second theme, I won't be much longer. The second theme that comes out very strongly is Lindsey's remarkable ability to bring together and develop people and build institutions, including, of course, CPO. Which has been Lindsey's passion project and a huge success. So Jill reminded me of the moment when Becky Francis and Alison Fuller first approached you, Lindsey, about creating what became CPO. And while many would have been terrified by the idea, especially at still a relatively early stage in their career, Lindsey always had a very clear vision of what the centre could become and jumped at it. And from there, the growth and success of the centre has been truly remarkable, with its name after a fictional anxious humanoid protocol droid from Star Wars. And actually very similar to CMPO now, I realised. So those roots, go deep, don't they? And the launch in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So that's where I edited out my second Robert Putnam story. And I won't tell it now. COPO has become a formidable active presence spanning research, policy and media. But as well as these things being important, I know the central passion for Lindsey is about developing people and working with people. So being on the recruitment panels for Lindsey's very many successfully funded research projects, for example, I have seen that brilliant people at all career stages go out of their way to have the opportunity to work with Lindsey. And in talking to Lindsey, it's really clear to me, and I'm sure all of you who work very closely with her in CPO feel this, that it's just as important to her to foster a supportive family at work environment as it is to have a vibrant research culture. And I know that this family at work approach has taken CPO together through some of the very toughest times. But alongside all this seriousness is the other side of Lindsey that absolutely everybody I've asked has mentioned in one way or another, and has been summed up by my final word, which Jill unwittingly, I think, unknowingly provided to me, which was goofing, I think. Yeah, goofing. Silliness was another word that's been often used. So whether this is a love of karaoke and singing and music, football, generally having a lot of fun, does that sound like somebody we all know? And so in order of your career here, I've just put up a few of the photographic contributions that I've had from friends, starting with CMPO and then PhD days. So thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you, Simon.
Matt Dixon. So karaoke evenings in Bristol, ending in power ballads through the streets of Clifton. Is that possible? Can we? My heart will go on. Morag Henderson describing Lindsey as a cultural omnivore, combining ABBA, Take That, and Taylor Swift with her love of statistics and data. Oh yes, sorry, I forgot to move these on. I'll let you absorb those. I'm nearly done. So there are numerous stories from conferences, away days, and social events after work, including the famous CPO annual lectures at Westminster Central Hall, And of course, it's extremely rare to have the opportunity in academia to present a slide of your colleagues in their swimming costumes. So Nikki, sure, thank you very much for that. Here's Lindsey, Jill, and Nikki swimming in the sea at the Applied Economics of Education conference in Italy. Right, so I couldn't finish my talk about Lindsey without saying something more about two of the most important influences on Lindsey, Paul Gregg and football. So Paul, I'll do football first. Football and Paul, but football sort of first. So Paul, as many of you are aware, and Lindsey has described so well in her talk, has undoubtedly been the original and most influential person in Lindsey's professional life, starting way back from when he taught her economics in her undergraduate degree. And when I contacted Paul about tonight, he told me about a conference in Manchester early in her PhD, where Lindsey spent a long time talking with Richard Blundell, who many of us know is one of the world's greatest labour economists, and economists more generally. So walking back afterwards, Paul asked what had they been discussing so intently. The answer, apparently, as Paul put it in his message to me, was bloody Manchester United. So Paul also gave me a quote that I wanted to end the evening with that I have found very moving. He said, "I was Lindsey's first boss in economics, her PhD supervisor, collaborator, and mentor. I helped design the New Deal program's tax credits and Sure Start for Gordon Brown, but my greatest achievement was bringing Lindsey through and helping her get where she is now." I'm so proud of her. I wanted to say it's striking how that sentiment of Paul's, the shaping of big policies that make a difference, and the dedication to bringing people through like Lindsey, mirrors those values of Lindsey's too, about policies and people, and I would say truly an intergenerational transmission to be celebrated. Yeah. So Lindsey, congratulations on your inaugural lecture and everything that you've achieved. We're enormously proud of you. And your CEPO colleagues have a gift for you now. And then I think it's time for you and them to invite you to drinks. So congratulations, Lindsey.
What is this?
Here's a small, enormous gift. Everyone at CPO say congratulations and well done. And
Oh my God, it's Lego!
okay, Lego.
It's CPO! Well, that's amazing. Thank you, everyone. I'm genuinely going to cry now. So
Lindsey, what do you want to say about the reception? Where is it?
It's out there.
And we can all just go there?
And we can all just go there.
Excellent.